So yes, this study looked at a 10-month period from June 2017 through to March inclusive 2018, covering 10 elections in 9 African countries. What we were seeking to understand is the way in which conversation on Twitter is influenced by parties inside the countries where elections are taking place and externally. So we didn't look at whether or not users of Twitter actually affected the outcome of elections. We were looking at the conversation that was taking place.
But Robert, you did highlight in the findings that at least 53% of the key influencers were not from countries where the elections were being held. Do you find this as something that could distort how the people in those certain areas believe or understand what the elections mean to them, or do you find this not having so much of an influence?
Well, of the key findings in the report, yes, indeed, that was the one that stood out for us, that on average, over half of the key influential voices in Twitter in the 10 elections that we looked at were from outside the countries in question. I think it's important to clarify that when you look into that group of about half of the influential voices, you then find a split between half being outside the continent and half being on the African continent. So it's a very diverse picture that we revealed. I think it demonstrates that people are interested, of course, in elections in Africa. We looked at African elections in this study, so we don't have a comparator with other parts of the world. I think if you looked at other parts of the world, you would find equally that external users of Twitter were influencing the discussion around elections. But that was actually the first key finding that we found. The second one was also incredibly interesting, which was around the prevalence of bots in elections. We found bots, in other words, Twitter accounts displaying machine-like behavior to be prevalent across all of the elections that we surveyed.
All right. Robert, give me a comparison between Kenya and Rwanda. Where do we fall when it comes to bots, actually bots handling Twitter accounts and tweeting when it's time for elections, or even after elections? How do we find these bots coming into play here?
Well, it's very interesting, actually, to contrast Kenya and Rwanda around this issue of bots, because Rwanda having about 4%, have bots representing about 4% of influential voices on Twitter is at one end of the spectrum, whereas Kenya having about 25% bots being influential is at the other end of the spectrum. So they are two extremes of the case of the prevalence of bots. But if you look at Kenya and Rwanda, you see actually some interesting parallels as well. In both Kenya and Rwanda, local voices were the dominant voices on Twitter during elections, unlike some other countries on the continent. Again, in Kenya and Rwanda, media and journalists were particularly prominent and influential voices. One other interesting contrast is the prevalence of business voices on Twitter during the elections.
All right. Robert, allow me to jump in there now on the case with politicians. We do see mostly when elections are happening outside of Africa, so much like on the, let's look maybe mainly on the use of Twitter in the United States. You find that the president is very, very keen on using Twitter. He's a tweeter. I don't know if that's the word. But even in Europe or in other developed countries, politicians are very, very prompt on responding on Twitter or even their campaigns. Much of the conversations or the debate is happening on social media. In Africa, that is rather different. Do you know why exactly?
Well, that is a very interesting point as well. And it really was the third key finding of our report. On average, we found that politicians represented about 10% of the influential voices on Twitter. Again, we don't have an international comparison necessarily to make, but as you point out, politicians in some other countries around the world are incredibly prominent and active on Twitter. I have to say again, there were very real contrasts between the countries that we looked at, in the sense that in Rwanda, about 1 in 3 influential voices were politicians, whereas in Kenya, to make that contrast again, it was something like 7%. So some real contrast appearing there.
Do you find the role of media outlets from Africa actually, when it comes to time for elections, like say a domestic media outlet, maybe like CNBC Africa or any other news outlet that has any role in the elections time?
Well, actually, the influence of media outlets, both national media outlets and international media outlets, was very pronounced right across the elections that we looked at. I've talked about bots, but it's interesting to point out that media outlets are probably 5 or 6 times more influential in shaping discussions on Twitter during elections. And I think that's really interesting because it shows that while bots are prevalent, people are wise to them and they're putting their trust in verified sources of information, such as media outlets.